I do want to thank you all for being here this weekend. This is a bit of an experiment. Every time we've done this before, this is, I think, the second attempt. I gave a series of talks in Saxton, Pennsylvania, that we used as kind of an outline. And the idea is for, some introductory classes to teach what the Center for Political Innovation is all about. I did them in Saxton, Pennsylvania. And then we did them in Kansas. We tried it once, and this is our second attempt. And our goal is to have classes like this and events like this around the country to bring people into the organization. And so, to cover all these different topics, but to have the speakers make it their own in their own way, to present the information that needs to be presented, but to do it in a way that kind of shares their personality with the audience, gets the audience talking. And so I think it's pretty safe to say that, for a trial run, we did pretty good today. Wouldn't you say? I think all of our speakers so far have done pretty well. And that it's an art to learn how to perfect these kinds of classes, to teach people these concepts, some of which might sound like common sense or just kind of typical Marxism, but some of which are quite unique. When we talk about the synthetic left, when we talk about overproduction, when we talk about the tendency of the falling rate of profit, some of these things, if you go back and read old 1920s, 1930s communist literature, this is just standard, par for the course. But you don't hear it very much anymore. And there's a lot of forces going around that speak in the name of Marxism that sound completely different than we do. And that's a problem, and that my topic, I'm giving class 2-4, which is on the origins of our organization, the Center for Political Innovation, where it came from, how we got here, what we're trying to do. And I've encouraged all the speakers so far to kind of make it their own, make it personal, let the audience get to know you. And so I feel like if I've encouraged other people to do that, I have the right to do it myself. So I will get a little bit personal in my presentation. I had an uncle when I was a kid who was a theater professor. He taught at DePaul University, and he taught at some different universities around the country. At the time of his death, he was teaching at DePaul University in Chicago. He taught theater. He had a PhD, and he had Marfan's syndrome, which is a heart condition, a lifelong heart condition. And he knew he didn't have a very long life expectancy because he was born with this heart condition. So he really became dedicated to living his life to the fullest. He couldn't ride a regular bicycle because of his heart condition, because he couldn't hunch over like this, so he rode a recumbent bicycle. And he actually circled the entire world on a recumbent bicycle. He was in a number of Hollywood movies. He was in, he had very small roles, and I think he was in the movie A Bridge Too Far, which is a World War II movie. He was in a few other Hollywood movies. He was very much an influence on me when I was young, and he died when I was 11 years old. He was only 45 years old when he died. And I went to his memorial service in Chicago in a room with about 300 people, and I heard about my uncle, who I just had always looked up to, and just, he was just kind of this great inspiration to me. And what I heard described by speaker after speaker was a man who, despite knowing that his life expectancy was very short because of his heart condition, had gone out of his way to live an exciting life. He wanted to go out and make a huge impact in the world. And he became a theater professor, and he biked around the world, and he did so much. And I remember, I had always loved my uncle because I grew up in a really, really small town. My high school graduating class was only 115 people. But my uncle lived in Evanston in Chicago. And when I would go to visit him as a kid, I was going to the city. And it was so exciting to be in Chicago, full of energy, full of excitement. And he was friends, this was the 90s, with all these people that were involved in theater and people that, some of which were political activists to some degree. And he seemed like just such an exciting person. And so when he died, I was very devastated. And then I sat there in this church listening to the story about my uncle, the theater professor, and the difference he had made in so many of his students' lives. So many of his students had gone on to be prominent actors, and they talked about how much they had influenced him. And I remember sitting there and hearing the bagpipes. He played the bagpipes. That was one of his hobbies, was he played the bagpipes, and hearing about my uncle, and that certainly had an impact on me. And, you know, I think it's great that we have a Shakespeare enthusiast here in the audience joining us this weekend. Because I've always particularly liked Hamlet. You know, Hamlet is probably the most famous Shakespeare play. Maybe it's Romeo and Juliet is also famous. I mean, they're all famous, right? But Hamlet is particularly loved. And the story of Hamlet, it's a tragedy. And the story is that there's this prince of Denmark who's just lost his father. His father has died, and he's very sad about it. His uncle has become the king, and his mother turned around and married his uncle, and he's just kind of sad about it. And one night he gets visited by a ghost. And this ghost appears to him and says, "Your father's death was not from natural causes. Your father was murdered by your uncle. Your uncle went and poured poison into his ear while he was sleeping and killed him. And so my throne was stolen by my younger brother. And you, as my son, it is now your responsibility to go and take vengeance and take the crown for yourself." So Hamlet gets this message from the ghost of his father, finds out that his father was murdered, finds out that it's his job to go and take the throne back and take vengeance and become the king of Denmark. But Hamlet doesn't have the will to do it. Hamlet is horrified by what he hears, and he spends the play, which is quite long, trying to figure out how he can not do it, looking for any possible way to avoid doing what it is that this ghost has told him that he has to do. And Hamlet, many of the soliloquies in it are almost a study in depression. Hamlet is suicidal. He's contemplating suicide, and he's walking about the stage talking about killing himself, saying, I've lost all my mirth. The sky, this goodly frame, is nothing but a sterile promontory. He's hopeless, and he's miserable. He talks about death as the undiscovered country, and he's just absolutely miserable. He thinks, maybe there's a way, maybe this is not true. Maybe this spirit, maybe I just dreamed all of this. Maybe this is a hallucination. So he hires a theater troupe to act out the murder of his father in front of the king, hoping that he can get a reaction out of the king to see if the king really reacts to it, if it really happened. And of course, the king sees this performance of the poison being poured in the ear, and the king, knowing that that's what he did, jumps up, and so he has confirmation that yes, the ghost was telling the truth. But Hamlet still just doesn't have the courage to go and do what he's supposed to do. And at one point, he's engaged to marry a woman, and he accidentally stabs her father through a curtain and kills her father. And he's just going through everything he can possibly do to not do what it is that he intends to do. His whole family just thinks he's lost his mind. They think he's just crazy. And ultimately, it all ends in, he's invited to what he thinks is a friendly sword fight, but they're actually going to kill him. And so some poison wine and some stabbing, and the whole play ends with everybody dead. It's a tragedy. And the tragedy is that Hamlet, the Prince of Denmark, didn't have the will to do what it was that needed to be done. He knew what he was supposed to do, but he didn't have the courage to do it. And that's why it speaks to us, because we've all been in situations like that, where there are things that we have to do that are very uncomfortable, that are scary, that are heart-wrenching, and we don't want to do them, but there's no way to get out of it, and you have to do it. And history selects you. History and circumstances put you into a situation where you have to do something. But you will do everything you can to get out of doing it, and you avoid trying to do it. And I've thought a lot about Hamlet when I think about how the Center for Political Innovation came into being, because history is demanding the formation of this organization. And if I could have not formed the Center for Political Innovation, if I could have stayed a happy member of the Workers' World Party, I would have done so. But that is not the circumstances that we're in. And I want to talk to you all about how we got here and how we're going to get out of this mess and how we're going to move forward and get the United States to socialism. In 2011, you'll remember Occupy Wall Street, right? Remember that? That's a distant memory now, but I was part of Occupy Wall Street. I had just moved to New York City a few months prior to that. Occupy Wall Street happened. People were marching in New York City. But at the same time that Occupy Wall Street was happening, the most prosperous country on the African continent, Libya, was being bombed and destroyed. And it was awful because at the same time, many young people were out in the streets protesting for the first time in their lives and chanting against the big banks, chanting against capitalism. Many of them somehow identified their movement with the CIA and the protest movement that they staged that eventually set the stage for the bombing of Libya. And in their minds, our revolution of the 99% and the CIA's revolution to destroy an African country and bomb it into smithereens were somehow the same thing. And it was a moment that was very bizarre because I was in the park the day it was announced that Gaddafi died. And there were two distinct perceptions of the situation in the park. The professional left, the people working for NGOs and foundations who were getting paid to be at Occupy Wall Street, who got all the MSNBC interviews, who were tied in with the Democratic Party, and the Trotskyites, let's not forget the Trotskyites selling their newspapers, and they all thought the death of Gaddafi was a great thing. Gaddafi was a brutal dictator. The working class of Libya has risen up against him. But there were a lot of people at Occupy Wall Street who didn't think that the death of Gaddafi was a good thing. But a lot of them were libertarians. And a lot of them were fans of Alex Jones. And a lot of them were from perspectives we wouldn't call left. But they were saying things like Gaddafi was killed because he was trying to create an independent African currency. Gaddafi was killed because he's doing business with Russia and China and not with Wall Street. Gaddafi was killed because Barack Obama was sending guns and weapons to radical Islamic extremists to try and overthrow him. And that these people that were wrong ideologically were more right politically about Libya than the people that were right ideologically that were running the Occupy Wall Street movement. And I, at the time, because Libya and the bombing of Libya, the protests against the destruction of Libya were so important, I made a point of studying Gaddafi and learning everything I could about it. And I got my hands on a book that we've since published called The Green Book. And that was the manifesto of Islamic socialism written by Muammar Gaddafi, explaining his teachings, the Third Universal Theory. And if you read that book, that's a socialist book. That is a book that is about overturning capitalism, creating popular committees to control the means of production. It says no one should make profits from food, no one should make profits from housing. It lays out a vision of a society beyond capitalism. It rejects Marxism because it says Libya does not have a very big proletariat. We don't have a lot of factory workers in Libya. But it should be the rule of all the people. And he invokes Islam, but he calls for, empowering women and empowering women's rights, more advanced rights for women in Libya than there were in many of the surrounding countries. It's a quite powerful book. And I read the Green Book, and I said, Libya is a socialist country. Libya is a socialist country. And I was informed by all the Marxists that I knew that Libya was not a socialist country. And I said, why is Libya not a socialist country? And they couldn't give me a reason. The reasons that they would give, Libya is not a socialist country. Gaddafi lives in a palace while all the people are starving. Well, first of all, it's not true. Second of all, don't they say that about Cuba also? Isn't Fidel living in a palace while the Cubans are starving? Aren't the Koreans all living in a palace while Kim Jong-un is? If that's the case, why is it true when they say it about Libya, but not true when they say it about Cuba, and not true when they say it about People's Korea? And in fact, there's much more of a state-run economy in Libya than in China or in Vietnam. There's far more state control. So if you equate socialism with state control, which we don't, but Libya would be far more socialist. There's not an economic difference between Islamic socialism in Gaddafi's Libya and Marxist socialism in Cuba. There's not an economic difference. The only difference is that Fidel Castro called himself a Marxist-Leninist and Gaddafi called himself an Islamic socialist. That's the only difference, is what label do you put on it? And we all know Marxism says labels don't matter. Words don't define reality. Socialism is about property relations. It's not about what label you put on it. It's not about what ideology the leader professes. So I looked at Libya, and no one could give me an argument about why Libya was not a socialist country. And in fact, Libya's entire development had been dependent on the Soviet Union. Libya had applied to join the Warsaw Pact at one point. And in fact, there's a paragraph in the Green Book that says their goal is to eventually have a world of vast material abundance where there's no state. They're trying to reach the final goal of communism. So how is Libya not a socialist country? It's not a socialist country because we said it's not, because no one knows. Well, that kind of nonsensical thinking forced me to ask some big questions. And seeing the way the left stabbed Libya in the back and refused to protest. But at the same time, many people that were against the establishment but had wrong ideas about why supported Libya. That was key for me. You know, one of the main organizations, probably the organization that did the most to stand up for Libya, was the Nation of Islam. They were in the streets protesting. They organized the Millions March in Harlem. And the Nation of Islam, they were out there supporting Gaddafi, saying that the bombing of Libya was wrong, that it needed to be opposed. They spoke up very, very loudly about it. And one point that they frequently made is they said they had to have the first black president bomb Africa. They wouldn't have gotten away with it. If George W. Bush had been president, I'm Commander-in-Chief of America, I'm going to bomb Libya, the world would have opposed it, and the black community would have opposed it. But it took Barack Obama to bomb and destroy Libya. And there were some folks at blackagendareport.com who started referring to the Democratic Party not as the lesser of two evils, but as the more effective evil. And if you look at the Obama administration, not only did they destroy Libya, but they escalated the war in Syria. And in many ways, in terms of the police state, in terms of the repression, they were certainly worse than the Bush administration, not better. And they did it more effectively. They did it with Europe on their side. And that situation, seeing the gap among people who went to the Occupy protests when it came to the bombing of Libya, seeing how the mainstream left lost its mind, and seeing how people who weren't quote-unquote left got it, that forced me to think. But then in 2013, I had a great opportunity. I had one of the most life-changing experiences that I've ever had. I got to go to Quito, Ecuador, to the World Festival of Youth and Students. Do people know what the World Festival of Youth and Students is? It's a communist gathering that happens every 4 years. They've been doing them since the end of the Second World War. And every 4 years, they have a festival, a gathering of communist youth organizations from around the world. It's the World Federation of Democratic Youth and the International Union of Students. They have this gathering. They were doing them every 4 years. After the fall of the Soviet Union, they stopped for a little bit, but Cuba revived it, and now they do them every 4 years. And at the very last minute, as an accident of history, I got to go to the festival. And the reason was that I had a passport, and my political group, they had not really been interested in going, but the Cubans, who were very close to them, called them up and were very angry that they were not sending anyone. So finally, they called me up in kind of a panic. Caleb, do you have a passport? I said, yes. Okay, can you go to Ecuador for a couple days? All right, you're getting on a plane in a couple days, go to Ecuador. And then they just grabbed the nearest youth they could find, put us on a plane, we went to Ecuador for a week. And I didn't even really know what I was going to. But I got on the internet and I read about the World Festival of Youth and Students, and I got to Quito, Ecuador. This gathering, 20,000 communist young people from around the world. Young people from Angola, young people from Vietnam, young people from Venezuela and Sri Lanka and India. And We got so much love and attention at that festival, even though we were just randomly going there. Every communist party from around the world wanted to talk to us. All these communists from around the world, from so many different countries, wanted to talk to the Americans. And you know why that is? It's because the work we do here is really important. And the communists that we met from these countries dressed a lot like I'm dressed right now. They wore suits and ties. They were professionals. And they represented huge organizations. Some of them were members of their country's parliaments. Some of them were the leaders of labor unions that had hundreds of thousands of members. These people were very, very serious. And I remember thinking about it at the time and thinking, if you're an American and you call yourself a communist, you have two choices. You can be in the Communist Party or DSA, and you're basically just a Democrat who thinks you're a communist. Or you can be an ultra-left. You can be screaming and yelling and burning the American flag and selling Trotsky newspapers and just ignored by society. You can be one of the two. But the people that I was meeting in Ecuador, they were not sellouts and reformists and people that had no, that were just kind of tailing after the bourgeoisie. And they were not nut jobs. They were not isolated from the people of their country. They believed in Marxism, they believed in socialism, and they represented huge organizations within their country. And they could talk to you up and down, backwards and forwards about Marx and Lenin and Stalin and Mao and all of this. They knew their ideology, and they also could criticize and explain their vision of how to build their country. Some of the experiences I had at that festival that I thought were amusing was, we came with some of our books. We had books on racism, books on the LGBT struggle. Some of these communist groups, from Namibia and Angola, they had the literature that the communist groups of Namibia and Angola and those countries are passing out. And the pamphlet said things like, don't use drugs, don't have sex before marriage and get pregnant, and that's because they're the governing party in their country, and they're trying to guide the youth of their country in a better way. And I remember seeing that and thinking, these folks were kind of conservative in a way, right? They're handing out pamphlets to their young people, telling them not to use drugs, and I remember that. And then the moment from the festival that I will never forget was when we first arrived. When our plane first landed in Ecuador, they were taking all the people, the young people that had come to Ecuador for the festival, to one particular part of the airport. They were moving us all into one particular part of the airport where they had buses that would then take us to Bicentennial Park in Quito, Ecuador, which is where the festival was held. And so we're in the airport, and there's communists from Greece and communists from Albania and communists from different countries, and we're all there. And then the whispering started among the group that the plane from North Korea had just landed. And everyone's whispering, the plane from North Korea has just landed. And then suddenly the door in the airport flew open. And in marched these North Korean youth, the Kim Il-sung youth of People's Korea. And the men were wearing suits and ties, and the women were wearing traditional Korean gowns, and they were in perfect unison. They were marching in perfect unison like this, and the whole airport went dead silent, like you could hear a pin drop. And then somebody somewhere started applauding. And somebody else somewhere started applauding. And pretty soon, this whole airport was screaming and cheering for North Korea. And I stood there in this moment, and I just felt the energy in that room. And I thought, this is where I belong. These are my people. These are the anti-imperialists. This is the people I've been looking for so long. And talking to these communists that I met from around the world and comparing them with the left of America, it was something I couldn't escape. It was something that came to me. It was thoughts came into my mind. Why is my organization floundering and falling apart? Why don't we sound like these communists around the world? Why do we sound more like an episode of Rachel Maddow than like these communists around the world? You couldn't escape that. It couldn't go out of your mind. Then in 2015, I was invited to go on a ship to Yemen. And I went with the Red Crescent Society of the Islamic Republic of Iran to attempt to deliver medical supplies to Yemen. And I went on a ship that was chartered from Iran, and from Bandar Abbas in southern Iran. And just as the war had started, and Saudi Arabia was bombing and destroying Yemen with the full support of the United States, I got on this ship that was chartered by Iran, and we spent 13 days on our way to Yemen to try and deliver medical aid. And the ship immediately created an international incident because at the time, John Kerry was negotiating the Iran nuclear deal. And Javad Zarif, who was the Iranian foreign minister, did not know that this ship was leaving Iran destined for Yemen. Apparently, the more hardliner faction in the Iranian government that didn't want to sign the nuclear deal, I did not know this at the time, had chartered the ship in the hopes of kind of embarrassing Javad Zarif and kind of sticking it to John Kerry. And this was there was some Iranian internal politics playing out. So immediately, as this ship from Iran left to try and go to Yemen, immediately both Saudi Arabia and Israel released a press release and told the media that they had evidence that our ship was smuggling weapons and that we were going to deliver weapons to Yemen, that we were trying to arm the Houthis, and that they announced that they would destroy the ship if it arrived because it was smuggling weapons. So I was on this ship being told that it's all over the international media that we're smuggling weapons. And Reuters quoted me. You can read, I was quoted about why I was on the ship by Reuters a couple times. I was in a lot of international media talking about why I was on this ship, saying that we don't have any weapons, that we're trying to deliver flour. We've got doctors on board. We've got surgeons on board. We've got, the technicians of an operating theater. We're trying to bring aid to people. This is not a military vessel. But the Israelis and the Saudis, they were making it clear that they considered this to be a military ship. And we got closer and closer to Yemen, and I was on this ship, and there weren't very many people on the ship that were English speakers. There was only a few. And Iran is a very religious country. As you all know, it's the Islamic Republic of Iran. And I grew up in a really small town, and my parents were very much religious, and I had a lot of religious education. And I kind of tried to forget that in New York City. When I first came to New York City, I noticed that when I would give a speech and I would make like a biblical allusion in a speech, people would cringe almost. I would say, they tell us America is a land of milk and honey, but it's actually, and then when I would say land of milk and honey, there'd be people in the audience that would go, like I'd said something awful, And I learned to almost be embarrassed of my religious upbringing because I didn't want to offend and alienate people. But as I was on this ship headed to Yemen, I'm surrounded by Iranians. I'm the only American on the ship. There was a German guy, there was a French citizen on the ship, and everyone else was Iranian. And of course, they're all very, very religious. These are some of the most religious Iranians that are risking their lives to try and bring medical aid to Yemen. They wanted to know the difference between Christianity and Islam. They wanted to know what I thought about Moses. They wanted to know what I thought about Abraham. They wanted to know what I thought about Isaiah, what I thought about Jesus, about the second coming, and we talked about nothing but religion for 13 days. And they weren't trying to convert me, mind you. That's what you talk about in Iran. And it kind of reminded me of growing up. Growing up when I would argue with people about politics. I'd argue about, is John Kerry better than George Bush? And someone would say, well, it's just like Moses. It's just like, it's just like what Abraham did. And I hadn't been around people who talked like that for years. But all of my religious training came back to me. And suddenly, I was telling them stories from the Bible, and they were telling me stories from the Quran, and we were talking about religion. And it was this spiritual feeling, suddenly, I was on that ship for a reason. And that the way I had grown up and who I was not a mistake, and it was not something I should be ashamed of. It's rather something I should embrace. Amen. And we didn't reach the port of Hodeidah. We got pretty close, but the day we were supposed to arrive, the Saudi military bombed the port of Hodeidah 8 times in a single day. And they killed at least 22 dock workers to keep our ship from arriving. And after they bombed and destroyed the port, we turned our ship around and we went to Djibouti. And 2 days later,
they bombed the medical university in Hodeidah as retaliation for the fact that the medical students were planning to greet our ship. And they killed 18 medical students. They just bombed the medical university there. And so we unloaded it in Djibouti, and we turned over all of our medical supplies and all of our food to the United Nations Relief Works Agency, and the TV cameras and the whole world saw that we did not have any weapons on that ship. We had flour, we had grain, we had medical supplies. It was a humanitarian mission. And that is a crime against humanity, to block humanitarian aid. And I witnessed it with my own eyes. And then after that, I went back to Iran. And I went back to Iran, and they took me to see the supreme leader of Iran. And that was an amazing experience in and of itself. But what was even more interesting was when I got back to Iran, there was a certain Iranian filmmaker who has since died. And he made a point of, riding around with me in his car and spending a lot of time talking to me. And as he talked to me, he started to say things to me like, Caleb, when you first came here, we saw that you lived in Brooklyn, New York, and we saw that you had curly hair and you were a communist. We thought you were of a certain demographic, but now that we get to know you, you're not that. You're from Ohio. And Caleb, there's a lot of people who come to Iran. Noam Chomsky visits Iran every so often. Norman Finkelstein comes to Iran. Minister Farrakhan goes to Iran. But you're different. People like you don't come to Iran. We don't have guys from Ohio who come to Iran very much. And in fact, it's guys from Ohio who want to kill all of us and think we're all Muslim terrorists and extremists. And, Caleb, you really ought to think about who you are and the role that you have to play and what you can do to change the world and bring about peace, because what you're doing is very, very important, very special. I also remember one of the conversations we had. He was riding with me, and he said, Caleb, do you ever think we could get Mel Gibson to come to Iran? And I cringed at the moment, and I'm like, geez, I'm not sure you would want that, and I'm thinking about some awful things that Mel Gibson has said, and I'm assuming that this is about Israel and Jews or whatever. And he turns to me, he's like, no, that's not what I'm getting at. And I'm like, wait, what? And he says to me, have you ever seen the movie Braveheart? I said, yeah, that was my favorite movie when I was a kid. He said, what about The Patriot? Have you ever seen The Patriot? I said, yeah. And he said, those are the most popular movies in Iran because a big part of the Shia revolutionary tradition is martyrdom. The idea that the most loved person is one who can sacrifice, give his life for God and for his cause. And so the movie Braveheart is one of the most favored movies in Iran. And that Mel Gibson has this huge following in Iran because his movies capture this essence, this heroic sacrifice, dying and going for a cause. I had never thought of it from that angle. And I felt kind of embarrassed that I was thinking that this was anti-Semitism. And that made me think, because that was one of my favorite movies when I was a kid. And I told you at my uncle's memorial, they played the bagpipes, and there you go. I'm an Irish American. I thought about that. I went to Venezuela a couple months later in December when they were having an election in Venezuela. And in Venezuela, this election in December of 2015, that's when the opposition in Venezuela won a huge sweep. The United Socialist Party had a lot of losses because the sanctions had really put the screws on Venezuela. The food shortages and all of that, and there was a feeling that Maduro wasn't handling it very well, and the opposition had very significant gains in 2015. And I was there when the election results came in, and the opposition gained a lot of seats in the parliament. And a lot of the people in the revolutionary movement were very, very disappointed by that. They were very worried that Venezuela could have a counter-revolution, could restore capitalism. And so I remember going to a neighborhood in central Caracas, and kind of the base of Hugo Chavez and the Bolivarian Revolution are these neighborhoods, these areas they call colectivos, right, which are kind of like communist cities where like local communist organizers kind of have the control, and they, the housing and the businesses are all collective cooperatives, and they have the businesses. And we went to a commune or a collectivo in central Caracas. We talked to the people there, and I remember one of the women there was 18 years old. She talked about how she had been a homeless child in Caracas. She'd been homeless. She hadn't even spoken Spanish. She'd only spoken one of the indigenous languages. And how she'd been adopted by a communist priest who ran this collectivo. and how living in this orphanage run by this communist priest, they had watched Hugo Chavez on television every day, and they'd watched him, and she said, Chavez raised me, she said, and he would read them Marx and Lenin books on the television, and he would read and then she said, Chavez is my father. Chavez is the only father I really ever had, it was Chavez and this communist priest. And she said, I am definitely a Christian. She said, I believe God brought me to this earth to die for communism. And that is what I'm going to do. I am going to die for communism. And she meant it too. She was wearing khaki army pants. They had plenty of guns at this colectivo. She said, I'm not worried about these election results. They're never going to come back. We're not the same people that we were before Hugo Chavez. And they are never going to come back. That's what she told us. And I remember hearing that and just being blown away. All of that. Again, you can't unhear these kinds of things. So it was in light of all of this that I started to realize that I had something I had to do. And then the election of Donald Trump happened in 2016. And that was an interesting election because Bernie Sanders also ascended that year. And there was a huge group of Americans talking about socialism. And you had Donald Trump rising. And Donald Trump said a lot of things about foreign policy that were pretty good, about how the United States is waging these wars. I got to tell you, one of the best moments of that election, say what you will about Donald Trump. I was a high school student when the USA invaded Iraq. And the US invasion of Iraq was done on the basis, they said Iraq was responsible for 9/11. They said, Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. It was all a lie. And I was against the war, and I was in a very small Republican town, and everyone else around me was saying, oh my God, we have to invade Iraq. It was so satisfying when Donald Trump turned to Jeb Bush and said, everybody knows your brother lied. They lied to us about weapons of mass destruction. And this guy was the Republican candidate for president. And he was saying what Michael Moore said in 2004. And that was a satisfying moment. That was a satisfying moment. And Bernie Sanders was running for office, talking about the very rich and the powerful and that has all this power. And I was looking at the communist groups that I was with, and I thought, why don't we try to win these Trump supporters to socialism? No, we can't do that. They're all racist. Why don't we try to engage with these Bernie Sanders supporters about what socialism really means? No, we can't do that. What are they focused on doing? Organizing Stop Trump protests. Trump is a Nazi. Trump is a racist. And trying to organize Stop Trump demonstrations. And what good did that achieve? MSNBC and CNN were at 24-hour Stop Trump demonstration already. What good did it do? That's where the foundation money was. That's where they could suck up to the Democrats. And it was around 2016 that I talked with some other people and we moved toward forming Students and Youth for a New America. A completely different approach to this kind of politics. To try and present socialism not as trying to destroy the United States, not as an attack on the working people of this country, but rather as something that would assert the will of the American people and make a better America by standing up to the war makers and the billionaires. And immediately after we formed the Students and Youth for a New America clubs, it was immediately declared, you're Nazis. It's like, how are we Nazis? Like, no, it was just a fact. We're Nazis. And I thought, it was just declared immediately. We're Nazis, we're white supremacists. And so I actually went and debated against an actual white supremacist. I found an actual white supremacist named Augustus Sol Invictus, who 2 months after I debated him went on to be part of the Charlottesville situation. And I actually had a debate with this white supremacist in which it was made very clear I did not agree with him. And he was arguing from one perspective and I was arguing from another. And Julian Assange watched the debate and tweeted it out. So cool. So it was quite widely viewed, this debate between me and Augustus Sol Invictus. So you would think now that settled it, right? No one can call you a white supremacist now because you debated an actual white supremacist and made clear you don't agree with him, right? No, now you platformed a white supremacist. This is how these games are played.
You kicked his ass.
Thank you. So, the Center for Political Innovation has come into existence. And I'd say that for a small group, and we are a small group, we've achieved quite a bit, and that we can be happy and boastful about that. But in a way, it's terrifying. Because if we, this small group, if we can achieve everything that we've achieved so easily, it means that there are other forces that have lots of money and lots of power and lots of influence and lots of people that are actively not achieving these things for much more sinister reasons than we realize. I'll just quickly go over our resume. Right? So when the war in Ukraine escalated in March of the previous year, we had a conference in Austin, Texas. That conference was just when the whole country was whipped up into this pro-Ukraine hysteria. We had a conference that opened with the Internationale and the Star-Spangled Banner, and we unfurled the Russian flag and the flag of the Donetsk People's Republic and the Z. And that room was packed, and that conference got a huge amount of attention, so much so that a website, trutherfiction.com, had to run an article making clear that our conference had actually happened and it wasn't just an internet hoax, right? Because there were like memes going around about Texas supports Russia and stuff like that. It was a really big deal, that conference that we held. Alex Saab, the Venezuelan diplomat, he was detained in Cape Verde, and when they finally extradited him to the United States, to Miami, where he's been held. He's now standing trial. The day that happened, we organized an emergency demonstration in Times Square to support freeing Alex Saab. And we had 10 or 15 people in Times Square in New York City. And that evening, Nicolas Maduro, the Venezuelan president, mentioned our demonstration in a speech. He said, they are in Times Square in New York City protesting. All right? What else have we done? Well, Nicaragua, socialist country. When their foreign minister came to the United Nations to give a speech, he was invited to a church in Harlem to come to the church service. And the anti-communist, Miami, Cuban, Nicaraguan crowd came to disrupt his speech. So we mobilized and we brought 22 people to the church to protect the foreign minister of Nicaragua. And when these right-wing people started disrupting, we chased them out and we blocked them from getting in there. And then we were invited to Nicaragua as election observers, and we were official election observers for the Nicaraguan election that happened a couple months later. We recently organized a summit against hypocrisy to counter Joe Biden's Democracy Summit, and it was a great gathering in Washington, D.C. Now, on February 19th, we were official sponsors of the Rage Against the War Machine protest, the biggest anti-war protest. Yeah. That's the biggest anti-war protest that's happened in Washington, D.C. since the time of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And we were official sponsors, and then afterwards, because Scott Ritter, a former UN weapons inspector who's become an anti-imperialist voice, because he was blocked out of speaking at that march, we gave him a reception afterwards. And almost 200 people, I would say, piled into that hotel ballroom to hear Scott Ritter speak and to engage with what the Center for Political Innovation had to offer. Back in March, when Tsai Ing-wen, the so-called president of Taiwan, came to the United States to beg for more weapons and for an escalation against China, the Center for Political Innovation, 5 of our members, confronted her on the streets of New York when we unfurled banners and we confronted her, and it went completely viral in Chinese media. And we called her out, said, stop sending weapons. People have seen the video. It was a great moment. Sage was there, so it was a great moment. I mean, there's a number of achievements I could go over. North Korea solidarity, right? Lately, we've highlighted the fact that the Trump camp seems to want to continue the negotiation process on the Korean Peninsula for whatever reason. But that's an opening. So we've made this banner that has a picture of Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un shaking hands. It says, "Finish what Trump started, peaceful reunification of the Korean Peninsula." We've taken that banner, we've unfurled it at the White House, we unfurled it on the streets of New York City, and you'll notice that it's having kind of an impact, because among the Trump camp, there's suddenly more interest in talking about that issue. And, let me add, on the podcast of none other than Roger Stone, the prominent Trump advisor, he had a guest, a guy from the Epoch Times, who was explaining why he doesn't like Tulsi Gabbard. And he said, Tulsi Gabbard's heavily influenced by the Center for Political Innovation. Apparently, we're a big impact on Tulsi Gabbard. Now, But my question is, why is it that such a small group of people is capable of doing this? Or rather, if we're capable of doing this, why are other forces with so many more resources and so much more members, why are they not doing things like this? With the little amount of money that we have, the little amount of membership that we have, y'all are great, but there's not that many of us, we have done all of this. And the reason is that other forces are controlled. And there's just no way to not talk about that. The Communist Party USA is terrified of us. We make them shit their pants, for Christ's sakes. They never criticize other groups. There's David Rovics, the anarchist folk singer. One of his songs, he's singing about different communist groups. He says, and the CP, they just do their thing and pretend the others don't exist. The Communist Party never talks about other groups. They talk about the Center for Political Innovation. Yes, they do. They ran a whole article denouncing us on their website because they have to, because so many of their younger members were watching our streams and were interested in us, and were joining the Communist Party because they want to do what we do. If the Communist Party was a communist party, they would do what we do. They're not a communist party. It's false advertising. And that is why we scare them so much, is we are doing what they should be doing. But I want to talk to you all about Hamlet again, because I want you to imagine an alternate ending to Hamlet. Imagine that ghost appears to Hamlet, says the truth about what happened to his father. So Hamlet goes into his room and he gathers his sword, and he goes and tells his friends and relatives, and he marches into the throne room and takes the crown for himself, and proclaims himself the rightful king of Denmark, and arrests his uncle for killing his father, and brings justice back to the country. Imagine that alternative ending to Hamlet. That's what would have happened if Hamlet had had the strength of character to do what he was intended to do. That's the happy ending. Wouldn't be very tragic. Not what Shakespeare was trying to accomplish with the story. However, he kind of gives away the plot in the beginning. I believe it's in the first act. There's a minor character whose father is sending his son off to travel. And he says to his son, he gives his son a long speech about, neither a borrower nor a lender be, and, gives him all kinds of advice for life. But then the last line of the soliloquy is to thine own self be true. To thine own self be true, which is the point of Hamlet. Hamlet can't be true to himself. He knows what he needs to do. He knows what he's been assigned to do, but he can't do it. And that's why it's a tragedy. And in the words of this other character, we hear the message of the play. Be true to who you are. Be the person that you are meant to be. Don't shy away from the role that's been assigned to you by history. That's what Hamlet is saying. That's what the play is intending to tell you. And it reminds me of Eugene Debs. Eugene Debs, the Canton, Ohio anti-war speech, the speech that Eugene Debs was thrown in prison for giving. It's a very long speech, but Eugene Debs, the leader of the Socialist Party, in 1918, when the USA is marching into World War I, he gave an anti-war speech in Canton, Ohio, and they threw him in jail. And it's a very long speech, and he talks about how the rich start the wars and the poor fight the wars, and he talks about a lot of things. But one of the best lines from the speech is he says, don't fall into the trap of the man who went to a Socialist Party meeting and heard the speeches and thought he should become a socialist and thought that the arguments he heard were unanswerable. But then when he left the rally, decided, oh, that might anger my boss. I can't do that. And Eugene Debs says, that man went to sleep that night and had a dreadful dream, because that's the kind of thing that happens to a person when they are at odds with their own conscience. And that if you want to be a socialist, to be a socialist means to look yourself in the face, to stand up with self-respect, to be in line with who you are meant to be, to have a clear conscience, to have pride in yourself. Go and read the words that you see in Eugene Debs. It sounds almost like Jordan Peterson or something. He's telling a socialist is someone who can stand up straight. A socialist is someone who can be proud. Read those words. Not the message that we're getting from the synthetic left. It's the message of Hamlet. To thine own self be true. Don't betray yourself. That's what it's saying. But the message that I have for you all here today is that if you want to be true to yourself, and if you want to stand up for what you know is true, and you want to move the United States in the direction that it needs to move in our time, you need comrades. You cannot do it alone. And that is what the ruling class wants. They want us all atomized and isolated on the internet, arguing with each other, lonely, hating the world, not thinking that there's anything we can do. That's what they want. They want us all to be just sitting there watching things fall apart, lashing out at each other, alone, isolated, pessimistic. And that a lot of socialists fall into what I call the dual delusions. It's kind of amazing to me, but they think two things, neither of which are true, and they seem almost completely contradictory to each other. I hear many young socialists, and older ones too, who believe that they have the one true answer. They have the exact correct interpretation. You know, if Marx were alive today, he would agree with them and no one else. They are the one true incarnation of it, and they are going to lead the revolution, and they are going to overthrow the government and establish the dictatorship of the proletariat. They are Lenin, they are Marx, they are the correct interpreters of Trotsky or Enver Hoxha or all of that. They have everything exactly right. And at the same time that they believe that they are it, they also believe there's nothing we can do. There's nothing we can do to change the course of history. We just have to just whatever the Democrats are doing, whatever there's nothing we can do. There's no point in joining an organization. Well, the thing is, neither of those things are true. Nobody in the United States who calls themselves a socialist or a communist or a revolutionary is the Bolsheviks, okay? We have to admit our movement is very small and isolated and weak. There's no way around that. But on the other hand, there's plenty that we can do. There's absolutely plenty that we can do. And Sigmund Freud talks a lot about stages of development. And one of the things that Sigmund Freud talks about is how a baby thinks it's the most powerful thing in the world. Because all the baby has to do is cry, and it gets fed, it gets rocked or whatever. But part of growing up is realizing your own capabilities, having an accurate assessment of what can I do, what can I not do. And as you start to understand your own strength and your own size, you can start to do things. And you can do them better. And that is what the Center for Political Innovation aims to do. We are aware of our own size, but we have been figuring out what we can do. And as we figure out what we can do, we are getting better at it and better at it. And we are crafting and we are perfecting and we're adjusting and we're moving ahead and we're going to do more things. And we're going to grow and we're going to expand. We are becoming aware of our own strength. And we are trying to intervene in the historical process. One thing, and there's a couple things that need to be said here. One thing that absolutely must be said is that you cannot advocate the violent overthrow of the American government. Why? First of all, it's illegal. Second of all, working people don't want the violent overthrow and they don't want a violent civil war to come to their country. And third, that's what capitalism is already leading to. The country's already coming apart. There's already instability. There's already rising crime. And if we go around acting like that's what we want, no one's going to listen to us. And that if you read William Z. Foster, if you read Gus Hall, you read Huey Newton and the Black Panthers, they didn't go around advocating violence. They went around advocating community empowerment. They went around promoting certain demands like jobs and housing and education that would improve people's lives, and mobilizing people around these demands that would make their lives better. And the understanding was that, yes, there may come a time where the people's organizations that they build to put forward their political demands become big enough that they can have an influence, that the capitalist government becomes violent and suppresses them and begins to try and take away their democratic rights. And if such a situation arises and the people have no choice, they may defend themselves. and that revolutions are an act of self-defense when it really gets down to it. And that's the perfect message, because there's nothing more American than the right to self-defense. And if we can put forward that kind of understanding, we can communicate to people in a serious way. We have a 4-point economic program. Now, this 4-point program that we've come forward with, it doesn't add up to socialism, right? In theory, hypothetically, one could have public control of banking, public control of natural resources, an economic bill of rights, and a mass mobilization to rebuild the country, and not have socialism, right? It could hypothetically possibly happen. But you have to understand those demands not in the context of playing SimCity. You ever play SimCity? Yeah, you know, I'm going to design a society that has these 4 things. Don't think of it that way. You got to think of it dialectically, right? You have to think of it in terms of history moving forward through struggle. So we're going to mobilize millions of unemployed people to start rebuilding the country. We're going to put all of banking and lending of money into the hands of the public and cancel the debt. We are going to put natural gas and oil and coal and timber and all the natural resources into the public budget. We're going to then use that money to enact an economic bill of rights to guarantee every American jobs, housing, and education. Now, do you know how much capitalist power you would have to defeat in order to do those things? All the banks would have to be defeated. All the big oil companies would have to be defeated. You would be up against so much capitalist power. So in the process of winning those kinds of demands, you would be building up such popular support and such a mass movement. If you were strong enough to force the state to do those 4 things, socialism wouldn't be very far off now, would it? You have to think of these things. And if you look at the history of revolutions, as was very well put by many of our speakers, Gavin among them, peace, land, and bread. Does peace, land, and bread add up to socialism? No. Does land to the tiller, right, in China, does that add up to socialism? No. But it creates the confrontation that lays the basis for empowering the working class to become the master of the destiny of the country. Another term that I think is very important, during the Cold War, the Communist Party, they put forward, great book, William Z. Foster, The Twilight of World Capitalism, 1948, and I think even still today on the Communist Party USA website, what is their stated purpose? Their stated goal, their immediate program, is the creation of an anti-monopoly government. An anti-monopoly government. Not the rule of the working class, but they want to build an anti-monopoly coalition that will create an anti-monopoly government. And in the context of imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, we know what that means. The big banks are monopolies. Silicon Valley are monopolies. The big oil companies are monopolies. But small business owners are not monopolies. Lower level capitalists are not monopolies. The working class are not monopolies. There's many people in society that can be polarized against the big monopolies. And that the goal is to create an anti-monopoly coalition, mobilize all of society against the ultra-rich, and defeat the ultra-rich, the monopolies, the big corporations. And in the process of doing that, empower the working class, and that the road to socialism in the United States is through an anti-monopoly coalition. And this is the understanding the Communist Party has for years and still on paper advocates. They still on paper advocate an anti-monopoly coalition. And the thing is, right now we are living in a period where, because of the tendency of the falling rate of profits and the problem of overproduction, and because of the divisions in the ruling class, a real anti-monopoly coalition could actually come into existence. Who pushed for the lockdowns that devastated so many working people's lives? It wasn't the lower levels of capital. It wasn't the small business owners. It certainly wasn't the working class. It was the big monopolies. It was Klaus Schwab. It was the World Economic Forum. And who's pushing to censor the internet? Who would censor the internet if they were given the power? It'd be the big tech monopolies. If you look at the debate in the United States, you've got the big monopolies that are with Joe Biden, and you've got demagogy and libertarianism and confusion and the lower levels of capital, etc., that are lining up on the Republican side. And we're starting to see a polarization of U.S. society between the big monopolies on the one hand and the beginning, the confused, backwards beginning of some kind of anti-monopoly coalition. And yeah, this side is not good, and yeah, we're not giving our endorsement to this side. But when things get better, it's going to be on this side. And we have to recognize that. When things start to get better, it's not going to come from the big monopolies. It's going to come from some kind of anti-monopoly coalition. And that is why the burning urgency of the moment is that socialists stop being the foot soldiers of the big monopolies and start trying their hardest to build the anti-monopoly coalition. That is the urgency of the moment. And that in this confused anti-monopoly side, some of those folks are very anti-war and some of them aren't. And some of those folks believe China is the main threat, and some of those folks don't. And the Miami Cuban crowd that wants to declare war on all the socialist governments of Latin America, they're mixed up in there. And Epoch Times and the Falun Gong is mixed up in there. And that it actually shows that there's a burning urgency that we intervene and make clear that if these lower levels of capital want to prosper, and if they want their businesses to get stronger, they need to defeat the big monopolies, and that they have an ally in China and Russia and Venezuela and Iran. And that I think there are already some people within that camp who are starting to think that way. The anti-war speech we've heard from Tulsi Gabbard and others indicates that there is a feeling among some of them that the all-out war and campaign to isolate Russia, to isolate Venezuela and Iran is hurting their profits. And that at the end of the day, if you really want to have power, if you really want to build a mass movement, you need the working class. Only the working class can make history the way that people want it made. And that you'll notice that Donald Trump, now that he's left office, all the neocons who pushed him to do all the bad things he did when he was president, John Bolton, for example, and others, they've jumped ship. And Donald Trump is amping up the things about him that sound kind of like the way we talk. Not for good reasons, but because he needs the working class to back him up. That's why. Because the ruling class has turned away from him. His allies in the ruling class have slipped away. And so Donald Trump, like Louis Bonaparte or whatever, is trying to build up support for himself among the other class, among the working class. Right? And this is what Donald Trump is doing. He's being isolated by his own class, and so he's building up support in the working class, much like what Roosevelt did. Tim talked about in his president what Roosevelt did. He was isolated in his own class. The National Association of Manufacturers were against him, so he started to build up support among the working class. Now, does that mean that we should blindly support Donald Trump or we should endorse him or campaign for him? Absolutely not. What that means is that there's a place for us to intervene. That's what it means. And what it means is that Donald Trump and the people gathered around him are not completely under the control of the capitalist class the way the big monopoly forces and the Democrats are. And what it means is that we can intervene there and effectively change the conversation. And what it also means is that ultimately, the only way an anti-monopoly coalition would ever take power, which what we have now is not an anti-monopoly coalition. It's the beginning of something that might turn into that. But the only way an anti-monopoly coalition could ever take power is if the working class, the wage workers of this country, in their millions, mobilized to bring them to power. That's the only way it could ever happen. And the Communist Manifesto talks about how the capitalists fight among themselves. And they begin to turn to the working class to be their foot soldiers. And in doing so, they are furnishing the workers with the weapons to overthrow the whole system. And how soon the relationship flips. And at the decisive hour, when society assumes a violent character, sections of the capitalist class start coming over to support the working class. The relationship flips. This is how revolutions tend to happen. So as we pay attention to this, we must be scientific. And that means breaking with the synthetic left. That means not falling into the trap of anti-populism. Elizabeth's presentation was very good. I did not know all of that about art, about the art and the way the art has been manipulated. It was fascinating information. Thank you. And I mean, Elizabeth, really, you guys have no idea how hard Elizabeth works for this group. You really don't. Please applaud for Elizabeth right now. When we talk about synthetic left, we're talking about a three-stage process. We're first talking about an attempt to manipulate leftist politics after World War II. How the CIA started funneling money to Trotskyites and others to kind of steal the thunder so that people that might become communists and anti-imperialists would go somewhere else and not go into the Communist Party, not align with the Soviet Union. The Congress for Cultural Freedom program, MK Ultra, the drug project, it was about making a barrier so that Americans who were alienated from society, who were having anti-establishment thoughts, didn't go to communism, they went to this other place. That was the first stage. The second stage was the color revolutions. And this was touched on by Liam in his presentation about how in the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc you had these intellectuals, these smarter people, these engineers, these scientists, these doctors who were frustrated in the socialist countries. They were somewhat trapped, They had good ideas, they couldn't put them into practice. They wanted to have a new idea and it was being ignored, and they felt stifled and frustrated, and they wanted more freedom. And how this synthetic left of CIA-funded academics and confused leftists suddenly became a vehicle for manipulating those people and getting them out into the streets and getting them to protest and block things and destabilize socialist countries. And that manipulating that intelligentsia, that revolutionary intelligentsia, was an effective mechanism for destabilizing socialist countries and eventually overthrowing them. And we saw the fall of the Soviet Union, how it devastated Eastern Europe. It devastated country after country. And at the time, in Czechoslovakia and Romania and Poland and all these places, a lot of those young college students, first of all, they were some of the most privileged people in their country. They were the children of the party elite. They were going to the universities. They were making films and doing art galleries. They didn't represent the farmers and the workers. They represented that kind of privileged strata. They were the children of the party elite on the one hand. And second of all, they didn't think they were marching for free market capitalism. They believed they were part of a global empowerment movement that was neither capitalist or socialist. It just wanted individual freedom and liberty. They thought they were marching for democratic socialism. They thought they were marching for anarchism. They thought they were marching for socialism with a human face. And Gorbachev, he believed that the USA would allow the Soviet Union to become a welfare state like Norway or Sweden. He thought, we'll dissolve the Soviet Union, we'll get rid of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and they'll just let us become a welfare state like Norway or Sweden. But that's not what happened. These people got duped, they got manipulated, they got conned. And in order to get them conned, they had to feed them some bullshit, synthetic left, classless, alienation, middle-class ideology, and they had to mesmerize them with American culture, American blue jeans, American cars, American movies, Beatles music. They had to mesmerize them and confuse them in order to dupe them and lead them off a cliff. And you can read many articles by people in the former Soviet Union who say things like, we didn't know what we had. We had no idea. And poll after poll after poll is shown in former socialist countries. Every single person says life was better before the fall of the Soviet Union. Life was better before socialism was overthrown. That doesn't mean life was perfect. That doesn't mean everything was great in these socialist countries. But it means that the returning of capitalism and Wall Street sinking its fangs into these countries once again had devastating effects. That's what it means. And that was the second stage. But the third stage is that they've now brought this color revolution apparatus home to the United States. Just like when Louis Bonaparte seized power in France, he brought divisions of the military he'd used to occupy North Africa back to France. That's what they're doing. The Foreign Legion of the CIA, the George Soros army, has been dispatched in America to try and stabilize capitalism in the United States because of an ongoing economic crisis. And they have only one solution of how to solve the crisis: drive down living conditions, degrow. That is the only solution they have. They want us to be poorer, they want us to depopulate, they want us to kill ourselves, they want us to not have children, they want our living standards to go down. That's their solution to save capitalism. That's the only thing they can think of. And they say it's because of climate change, and they give other reasons, but that's the only solution they have to save it. And they know that the American people in their bones will not accept it. They know that Americans will not accept it. If there's ever been a people who will not accept degrowth, it is the American people. This whole country, the whole attitude that we've had our whole life is that this country is about growth and optimism and innovation. And so in order to shove degrowth and impoverishment and austerity down our throats, they are going to have to employ and deploy every George Soros color revolution apparatus on this country. They are going to have to psychologically manipulate us on such an extreme level because we won't accept it. That's what they know, and that's what's happening right now. The wokeification of America is their attempt to save capitalism with degrowth and drive down living standards to save their system in the face of a population who've been told all their life that America is the land of milk and honey and opportunity. Thanks for not cringing when I said that. And that this whole country is about growth and optimism. And that gives us an opening. Because we now can step into the fray and say that if you want growth, and if you want opportunity, you want a better life for your kids, we need to have socialism. That's our opportunity. It's not the only opportunity we've got. What have we been told our whole lives is wrong with communism? Why can't people in America become socialists or communists? Well, communists are atheists. Communists don't believe in God and Christianity and religion. We're all a bunch of godless atheists. Well, if you go to Nicaragua, the slogan I saw painted everywhere says Christianity, socialism, and solidarity. And the same in Venezuela. And in fact, the leader of the Russian Communist Party, Gennady Zyuganov, he is an Orthodox Christian. The communist world has largely corrected and adjusted from the mistakes that were made. Meanwhile, when I turn on American television, I see Richard Dawkins. I see Sam Harris. I see people that are telling me that there is no God and that God is just a scam made by people who want you to be compassionate. I hear people quoting Ayn Rand, who called Christianity the guilt-peddling Jesus industry. And all of a sudden, I'm hearing voices from the ruling class that are pushing atheism, but it's not the atheism and the dialectical materialism of Karl Marx. It's an atheism that says religion is bad because it wants you to care about your fellow human beings. It says religion is bad because it says you should live for something higher than yourself. That's the atheism that they're pushing. It's rooted in the philosophical irrationalism of Friedrich Nietzsche, and it is a poisonous, sociopathic ideology. And the American people know that, and they hear that in their bones. And so now is our opportunity to say, if you really want to carry out the teachings of Jesus Christ, if you really want to stand for truth and justice in the world, you got to be a communist. And another thing we've been told about communism our whole lives is that communism is against America. It's against the American way of life. We in America, we just don't believe in that. If you become a communist, you're disrespecting the flag and Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, and you're giving up the American dream. And if you want to be loyal to your country, you can't be a communist. And that's funny because, when I open the New York Times, I read the 1619 Project. It says the entire purpose of this country was just to have slavery. And I hear that America is a woke, evil settler country, and that's why we need to accept this austerity, because we all deserve to be poor and we don't deserve it. And that I look at that and I say, well, geez, this creates an opportunity for us to say that if you really want to love your country, don't be proud of, Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. Be proud of John Brown. Be proud of Harriet Tubman. Be proud of Gus Hall and Eugene Debs and Huey Newton. Be proud of the labor unions and the progressive organizers, the suffragists. And we can say that the true patriotism of the American people is the spirit of struggle and standing for truth. And so you chuck your phony patriotism. You try to make us accept degrowth in the name of wokeification. You've created an opening for us to say that we're the true patriots, and we represent the true patriotic, loyal, peace-loving spirit that's always been here within the American people but has been hidden. It's been hidden from us. And that not only is it the blood of racist cowboys and warmongers that goes through our veins, but we also have within our history the abolitionists, the suffragists, the freedom fighters, all the good people in American history have stood against all the evil things this country have done. They're part of our history too, and it's only a matter of time before that part of the American spirit takes power in Washington, D.C. So I do want to conclude my remarks now. Retreat's not over. I hope you're all thinking about what you're going to do at the talent show we've got tonight. But I want to say one of the most telling things about the synthetic left ideology and about a lot of what's being peddled on the right, the libertarianism, is that it's all individually focused. It's all about finding your own place as an individual, finding your grievances as an individual, not allowing any collective to come. And that goes against human nature, right? We're always lectured about human nature. Well, one thing about human nature is that human beings are collective creatures. Every building in the New York City skyline is the collective labor of thousands and thousands of people. And every product in every store is the collective labor of thousands of people. It was transported by workers. It's workers there selling it to you. Everything human beings have ever done has been collective. We are a collective species. It's not a debate about collective versus individual. It's about collectivism for what? Should we operate collectively to make more money for Wall Street, to make more money for the big banks, to create more unemployment, to make people starve on the street, to make new bioweapons, to unleash germs and create new pandemics? Or should we work collectively to make a better future for our children? Should we work collectively to advance human civilization to even higher stages? That's the question. What kind of collectivism will we have? Well, what I see here at this retreat is the beginning of the kind of collectivism that we need and the organization that we need to change the minds and challenge the thinking of the American people to move us in the right direction. Thank you.
CPI, 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 we are city builders. City builders. We are city builders. We are city builders. Dare to struggle. Dare to win. Dare to struggle. Dare to win. Dare to struggle. Dare to win. Dare to struggle. Dare to win.